All right. One of the big assignments you're going to do in this post war period is a television assignment. Television is going to become much more prevalent in the United States in the late 40s and early 50s and really start to replace radio as the force that is helping to shape our culture. Now, television isn't as radical a change as radio was, right? We talked about radio in the 20s creating a common culture across the country, but television is going to extend that influence into other areas. Things like fashion or design, things like that, because now you could see what people are wearing, where they're at, what things look like. And so television is just adding another dimension to what was already going on. Televisions used to look like the image that you see on the screen. Now, I'm not quite old enough to remember this style of television. This was an old black and white set from the 50s, but I do remember growing up in the 1980s having a what they called a floor model television, and it had a wooden cabinet around it. It was very much kind of a piece of furniture. Again, echoing back to those early days of the radio, um, that just kind of was there, right? That was the way television was done. Now, of course, today we've got the televisions usually that hang on our walls, and have like gazillions of pixels and things like that. But let's look at television and the way that culture gets created. In the 1950s, the most popular show in America was the I Love Lucy show. It starred Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. Lucy had been a radio star. Before this, she had her own radio show, and they asked her to move it to television. She said, "Well, I'll do that, but I want my husband to also star in it." Her husband's name was Desi Arnaz. He was a Cuban American, and so they very quickly become the first mixed race couple on television. It was a half-hour comedy, and Lucy is still shown around the world today. It's never kind of gone off the air. Lucy and Desi actually come up with reruns. They were one of the first television shows to tape their show, but they also made sure that they owned the rights to it. So anytime it was going to be shown after that first time, you're paying Desilu, which was their company. But um, she was a comedian, and this was very much kind of appointment television, watching the weekly adventures of Lucy and Ricky, and then Fred and Ethel, their neighbors that were there as well. The most popular genre on television, really up until the 1970s, is the Western. If you look back in the 50s and early 60s at the top 10 television shows, seven or eight of them are going to be Westerns. This picture is from the show Bonanza, but there were tons. Have Gun Will Travel, Maverick, pretty much like I said, every television station is going to have Westerns, and they were an extremely popular show. My grandfather, when he was alive, still watched the Western Channel, and just loved to watch those things. So you'll see a lot of westerns being used um, in that. Gunsmoke, up until The Simpsons a couple of years ago, Gunsmoke had run for over 20 seasons and was the longest running television show. And I think The Simpsons, like I said, passed that a couple of years ago. What's going to change is the launch of Sputnik, and then space shows. Now, if you've ever seen Star Trek, near and dear to my heart, I'm an equal opportunity geek. I'll go for Star Wars or Star Trek. But Star Trek is basically a Western in space. Uh, but people become fascinated with this kind of as the space race is going on. Star Trek itself is only on for 3 seasons. It's only in reruns that it gains a lot of popularity, and then eventually ends up transferring into movies and then other television shows and things like that. Very much mirrors, though, if I have any Toy Story fans in the listening audience, the switch from Woody to Buzz in in Toy Story. So let that blow your mind for a second. Pixar showing what's going on. Television news was different back in the early days of television. Usually, it had a half-hour news program that would be on at 6 or 6:30 in the evening, and that was how you got your news. Guys like Walter Cronkite, and we're going to see this guy a ton when we do our 1960s unit, were there every night to tell you the most important things that were going on in the world during that day. Now, obviously, with a half hour, you really have to figure out what the important things are. And they really tried their best to be very objective. That they didn't have opinion pieces and people trying to spin or give slants on the news. You don't see that as much until we get to 24-hour news that'll come later. But your news anchor, usually people got really loyal to one news anchor and one news show, but that was the guy who was telling you what was going on in the world. Walter Cronkite is going to be there telling people that President Kennedy has been shot. He's going to be there talking about the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War. He's going to be there when the moon landing happens in 1969. So you really kind of got attached to those guys. The first televised debates in history are the Nixon-Kennedy debates. So politics meets television, and it really kind of changes things. You look at the data, and people that heard on the radio thought Nixon won these debates, but people that saw it on television thought Kennedy won. He came off better on television. He looked tanned and rested, and it switches up now the way that people are going to run for office, right? Really, if you want a kind of a national office today, you've got to have television time. Living where we do, we get a lot from Kentucky, but man, when there's an election going on, there's nothing but political ads that are there. That's hundreds of millions of dollars that are being pumped into, trying to convince people using this form of media. Vietnam becomes known as the television war because unlike all the wars that have come before it, now you've got images that can meet people in their living rooms every night. This isn't like going and seeing a World War II newsreel 6 months after the battle happened, during that war. Every night you're seeing, the number of Americans who've been killed in Vietnam that day. You're confronted with these much more than you would have been at other times in our nation's history. And it's one of the reasons that people give for the unpopularity of that war. 1969, the moon landing. This has been one that I would have got up to see. I think it was like 2 or 3 in the morning. But people getting up to see Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin take the first steps on the moon, kind of the finish line of the space race that had been going on all through the decade, but shown on television screens all around the world. In 1978-79, ESPN will become a 24-hour news network. It's right around the time I was born because I didn't want to live in a time where there weren't 24-hour sports. But what people started to figure out was if you're going to have a channel dedicated to something, it's hard to fill all that time, right? And so I remember even being a kid, and the stuff that used to pass for sports on ESPN wouldn't pass for sports today. Today they've got the NBA and the NFL and that kind of stuff. Back then they were showing like dart throwing, World's Strongest Man competition was on there like every other program. But it's something that has definitely advanced. But that's brought a lot of money into sports and shined the spotlight on a lot of sports that maybe didn't get it before that particular time. The most watched television show in history is still the finale of a show called MASH. MASH was set during the Korean War, but on in the 70s and early 80s. Its last show, Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen, it was still a very popular show. They just ended it because it had been on for 11 or 12 seasons. The story gets told that in certain cities, the people running the waste treatment plants could tell when commercials were because everybody was running to the bathroom and they could tell all the toilets were flushing at the same time. But that's the most watched program in history. Mysteries got to be really big when I was younger, there was a show called Dallas. It was a Friday night kind of soap opera kind of thing, starring this guy Larry Hagman, who was J.R. Ewing. And at the end of one of the seasons, they used an old trick from cinema in the 1920s and 30s, and they had a cliffhanger. J.R., the character that you see here, gets shot at the end of the last episode of a season. And so all summer, the big deal was who shot JR. They actually taped every member of the cast and even some members of the crew holding the gun and shooting JR because they didn't want it to get out who had shot him. And so that was one everybody was talking about, and then everybody wanted to see when it came back who was the person that did it. Today, television has changed, right? With streaming services, hundreds of channels available. You don't have that kind of what they call water cooler TV anymore, where you know 60 or 70% of people are watching the same program. For you guys, you may not even watch that much television at all, right? You've got TikTok and YouTube and things like that. And so it's very rare. Even our really popular shows today, if you count the percentage of eyeballs that are watching them, aren't even close to some of the things that we were seeing before. But television is still a cultural force that's out there. It continues to adapt and grow in some interesting ways. Still in a couple of weeks it'll be time for the Super Bowl. That's still the most watched television program every year. Millions of dollars will be spent on advertising during those. I know my wife likes to watch the Super Bowl just for the commercials. Doesn't care about football, but likes the commercials. So television, like I said, still around today, and this is going to connect with an assignment that you've got that's going to be coming up.